Picture a single man standing in a throne room larger than any building the world had ever raised, looking out over a country that did not exist before him. To the east, 6 rival kingdoms that had fought each other for 250 years are gone. Their kings are dead or captive. Their armies are scattered. Their borders have been erased. And this man, who calls himself the first emperor, believes his family will rule for 10,000 generations. He is wrong. The empire he built will outlive him by less than 4 years. It will be the shortest major dynasty in the entire history of China. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, we still call that country by his family's name. This is the story of how a small horse-breeding tribe on the western frontier became the most ruthless war machine of the ancient world, conquered everything in sight, invented the idea of a unified China, and then burned out so fast that it became a warning every later ruler would study. This is the entire history of the Qin. If you are enjoying this already, hit like and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you know. Now here is a question I want you to sit with as we go. If you were a farmer living on the western edge of the Zhou world, watching this strange, disciplined state rise up beside you, swallowing its neighbors one by one, would you have feared it, or would you have wanted to join it? Drop your answer in the comments. Most people who know anything about ancient China know one image: rows and rows of life-sized clay soldiers buried underground, standing guard over a tomb. That is the Terracotta Army, and it belongs to the man at the center of this story. But the clay soldiers are the very end of a road that runs for almost 7 centuries. To understand why one ruler would bury an entire army in the ground, you have to understand where his people came from, how they were treated, what they learned, and what kind of state they slowly, deliberately built. Over the next few hours, we are going to walk that entire road, from a clan that bred horses for a king who barely noticed them, to the reforms that turned a backward state into a weapon, to the conquest that ended the longest age of war in Chinese history, and finally to the collapse that happened so quickly it stunned everyone alive. Let us start at the very beginning, on the dusty western frontier, long before anyone imagined an empire. The people from the west, the Qin, did not begin as conquerors, they began as servants. In the centuries before our story truly opens, the dominant power in the Chinese world was the Zhou. The Zhou king sat at the top of a sprawling system of noble families, each granted land and a title in exchange for loyalty and military service. This was a world of ranked lords, ancestral temples, ritual bronze vessels, and carefully guarded bloodlines. To matter in that world, you needed a pedigree. You needed to belong. The Qin at first did not belong. Their ancestors came from a clan called the Ying, and what the Ying were known for was animals. They were herders and horse breeders, living out on the rough western margins where the settled farmland of the Zhou heartland faded into open grazing country and the territory of the nomadic Rong peoples. This was not a place of refinement. It was a place of dust, frontier raids, and hard winters. What changed their fortunes was a horse. Around the 9th century BC, a man remembered as Feizi managed the royal herd so well that the Zhou king granted him a small piece of land and the right to continue the family's sacrifices. That piece of land was called Qin, and that is where the name comes from. The Ying clan now had a foothold, a name, and a job. They were the king's horsemen on the dangerous western edge. For generations, that is what they remained. They were useful, they were tough, and they were looked down upon by the older noble houses of the East, who saw them as half-barbarian frontiersmen who happened to speak the right language. The Qin lived close to the Rong tribes, fought them constantly, traded with them, intermarried at the edges, and absorbed some of their ways. The polished nobles of the Central Plains found all of this slightly distasteful. That contempt would last for centuries, and the Qin would never forget it. Here is something worth pausing on. The country we call China takes its English name, almost certainly, from this very word, Qin, pronounced closer to Chin. The same route traveled along the trade routes into Persia, into India as Sina, and eventually into the European languages. So the dynasty that ruled a unified China for only about 15 years ended up lending its name to the land for the next 2,000 years and counting. A frontier horse clan gave its name to a quarter of humanity. The turning point came with the collapse of the early Zhou order. In the year 771 BC, the Zhou capital in the west was overrun. Hostile tribes and rebellious lords stormed it, and the king was killed. The surviving Zhou court decided to abandon the ruined western homeland and flee east to a new capital near modern Luoyang. This is the moment historians use to divide Zhou history into the strong early period and the long weak later period. And here the Qin saw their chance. As the royal household fled east, it was the Lord of Qin, Duke Xiang, who provided armed escort and protection. In return, the new king did something the older nobles would have found outrageous. He elevated the Qin from frontier caretakers to a full noble state, a recognized lord with a recognized rank. And he made them an offer that was really a challenge. The old Zhou homeland in the west, the rich Wei River Valley, was now overrun by the wrong tribes. The king essentially told the Qin, "If you can take it back from the tribes, it is yours." That was the founding bargain of everything that followed. The Qin were not given a comfortable, settled domain. They were handed a war zone and told to earn it. And over the next several generations, that is exactly what they did. They fought their way into the Wei Valley, pushed the tribes back, and slowly turned the old western heartland of the Zhou into their own base. The very contempt that had been aimed at them became an advantage. While the eastern states refined their court rituals, the Qin spent generations doing nothing but fighting for survival on an open frontier. They were becoming, without quite realizing it yet, the hardest people in the Chinese world, Duke Mu and the Western power. By the 7th century BC, the Chinese world had settled into a pattern historians call the Spring and Autumn period. The Zhou king still sat on his throne in the east, still performed the great sacrifices, still held a kind of sacred authority, but real power had drained away from him and pooled in the hands of the strongest regional lords. These lords competed for the unofficial title of hegemon, the leading lord who would protect the king, keep order among the states, and lead joint campaigns against outsiders. It was a world of shifting alliances, formal treaties sworn over animal blood, and constant low-level warfare. Into this world stepped the most important early Qin ruler, Duke Mu, who reigned for roughly 4 decades in the 7th century BC. He is the man who first made the rest of China take the Qin seriously. Duke Mu understood something his rivals often forgot. Talent matters more than birth. He went looking for capable men wherever he could find them, and he did not care about their origins. The most famous example is an old advisor named Bailey Shi, who, according to the traditional account, had fallen into slavery and was bought back by Duke Mu for the price of 5 ram skins. Whether every detail of that story is exact, the lesson the Qin drew from it was real. A ruler who recruits ability from anywhere, regardless of pedigree, will outperform one who only promotes his cousins. That idea would become a permanent feature of Qin statecraft, and centuries later it would help win them an empire. Duke Mu's ambitions ran east, toward the rich central states. He wanted to be the hegemon of all China. But the powerful state of Jin sat directly between Qin and the east, blocking the road like a mountain. Duke Mu tried everything. He married his daughter into the Jin ruling house. He intervened in Jin's brutal succession struggles, even helping to install a Jin ruler he hoped would be grateful. None of it gave him the breakthrough he wanted. Jin remained strong, suspicious, and in the way. The bitterest lesson came at a mountain pass called Yao. Duke Mu sent an army deep east on an overambitious raid, and Jin ambushed it on the way home in a narrow defile. The Qin force was annihilated. Their commanders were captured. It was a humiliating disaster, and it taught the Qin a hard truth that they would honor for the next 400 years. Pushing east against a strong, unified rival before you are ready is suicide. Build your base first. So Duke Mu turned the other direction. If the road east was blocked, he would expand west into the lands of the wrong tribes that the Qin already knew so well. And here he succeeded brilliantly. Using a defector from the wrong who knew their politics, Duke Mu played the tribes against one another and then crushed them. The traditional accounts say he brought a dozen or more wrong states under Qin control and pushed Qin's western boundary far out into the steppe. The Zhou king formally congratulated him as the master of the western lands. This is the foundation that everything later rests on. While Duke Mu never became the hegemon of the central states, he made Qin the unquestioned power of the entire West. He gave the state depth, manpower, grazing land, and horses, always more horses. He absorbed peoples and resources that the eastern states could not touch because they did not even know that frontier. When the eastern lords looked at a map, they tended to ignore the far west, treating it as empty barbarian country. They were ignoring the slow growth of the state that would one day eat them all. After Duke Mu died, Qin entered a long, quiet stretch. For a couple of centuries it was a real power, but not a dominant one. It held the West, fought its neighbors, and waited. The center of gravity in Chinese politics stayed in the east, among the great states of Jin, Qi, Chu, and the others. Qin was strong, but it was off to the side. To the sophisticated Easterners, it remained the rough cousin out west, important, but not quite respectable. That low profile was about to become a problem, because as the spring and autumn period gave way to something far more violent, Qin would discover that simply holding the West was no longer enough to stay safe. The age of warring states begins. Around the 5th century BC, the old order finally broke for good. The great northern state of Jin, the same Jin that had blocked Duke Mu for so long, tore itself apart. Its most powerful noble families had grown stronger than the ruling house itself, and in time 3 of them simply carved Jin into 3 new states. We call them Han, Zhao, and Wei. The Zhou king, by now almost completely powerless, was eventually forced to recognize these 3 usurping families as legitimate lords. The moment he did, any pretense that noble rank came from sacred Zhou authority collapsed. From now on, power came from the sword, and everyone knew it. This is the beginning of the period we call the Warring States. The polite fiction of the hegemon protecting the king was gone. In its place came a brutal, open contest among a handful of large kingdoms, each trying to swallow the others. Warfare changed completely. The old chivalric chariot battles, fought by aristocrats according to ritual rules, gave way to mass infantry armies, conscripted from the peasantry, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Campaigns lasted years. Sieges starved entire cities. The goal was no longer to win honor or to humble a rival. The goal was annihilation. There were, by the time the dust settled, 7 major contenders. In the far west sat Qin. In the far south sprawled the enormous state of Chu, vast and populous, but loosely organized. In the east lay wealthy Qi, with its great commercial cities. In the far northeast sat Yan, cold and remote. And in the center, where Jin had once stood, were the 3 successor states, Han, Wei, and Zhao, packed dangerously close together. Historians call these the 7 warring states, and for the next 2.5 centuries, they would fight almost without pause. Now, you might expect Qin, with its hard frontier population and its deep western base, to have dominated from the start. It did not. At the opening of the Warring States period, Qin was in trouble. The problem was right next door. The state of Wei, one of the three pieces of old Jin, had reformed early and reformed well. Under capable rulers and a brilliant general named Wu Qi, Wei built a professional, heavily trained army of elite soldiers, and Wei used that army to hammer Qin. In a series of campaigns, Wei seized the region west of the Yellow River, a strip of strategically vital land that historians call Hexi, the area west of the river. Losing it was a disaster. It put a hostile, well-organized power right on Qin's doorstep, with a clear road into the Qin heartland. For Qin, this was a moment of genuine crisis and genuine shame. The eastern states, watching Wei batter the western frontier, openly treated Qin as a barbarian backwater that did not even deserve a seat at the great diplomatic gatherings. They would meet to discuss the balance of power among civilized states and simply not invite Qin the way you might not invite the rough family from the edge of town. For a people who had spent centuries earning their place, this contempt burned. Internally, Qin was also a mess. The old noble clans held too much independent power. Succession was unstable. For a stretch, there were repeated palace struggles, weak rulers, and short reigns. A state cannot fight effectively when its own great families are scheming against the throne and against each other. Qin had manpower and toughness, but it lacked organization. And against a disciplined enemy like Wei, organization was everything. This is the low point of the Qin story. A proud, hard people, hemmed in, beaten on their own border, mocked by the East, and weakened from within. If you had surveyed the 7 states at this moment and tried to predict which one would conquer all the rest, Qin would not have been your first guess. It might not have been your 5th. And then, into this struggling state, came a young, ambitious ruler determined to fix it, and a foreign advisor with a cold, radical, and frighteningly effective set of ideas. Their partnership would change not just Qin, but the entire future of China. Shang Yang and the Great Transformation. The ruler was Duke Xiao, who took the Qin throne in the middle of the 4th century BC as a young man. He inherited a state that had been losing ground for decades, and he was furious about it. He looked at the contempt of the eastern lords and the lost territory in the west, and he decided he would not accept it. So he did something his ancestors had done before him. He issued a public call for talent. He announced, in effect, that any man who could come to Qin and offer a plan to make the state strong would be rewarded with high rank and land. He did not care where they came from. The man who answered that call was named Wei Yang, though history would come to know him as Shang Yang, after the territory he was later granted. He was not from Qin. He came out of the very state, Wei, that had been beating Qin, where he had served as a minor official and absorbed a hard-edged school of political thinking. When his prospects in the east stalled, he traveled west to try his ideas on a ruler desperate enough to listen. The philosophy Shang Yang carried with him is usually called legalism, though that English word does not quite capture it. It was not really about law in the sense of justice. It was about control. The core belief was bleak and simple. Human beings act out of self-interest and fear. They are not naturally good, and appeals to virtue and tradition will not make them obey. What makes a state strong is not the moral character of its people, but the design of its institutions. If you build a system of clear rules, predictable rewards, and terrifying punishments, you can channel ordinary selfish humans into doing exactly what the state needs. The ruler does not need good subjects. The ruler needs a good machine. Duke Xiao gave Shang Yang the authority to build that machine, and Shang Yang built it with a thoroughness that shocked everyone. He began by attacking the source of the old chaos, the power of the hereditary aristocracy. In the old system, you were born into your rank. A great noble was a great noble no matter how useless he was, and a peasant stayed a peasant no matter how brave. Shang Yang tore that up. He created a new ladder of ranks, around 20 of them, and he tied advancement to one thing above all: military achievement. If you killed enemy soldiers in battle and could prove it, you rose. If you rose high enough, you got land, tax exemptions, and legal privileges for your family. A common farmer's son could climb that ladder by fighting well. And just as shocking, a born aristocrat who contributed nothing could find himself stripped of his standing. For the old families, this was an outrage. For the ambitious poor, it was the chance of a lifetime. And for the state, it meant that the entire population now had a powerful personal reason to fight hard and win. Then he reorganized the people themselves. Households were grouped together into units of 5 and 10 families, and the families within each unit were made legally responsible for one another. If one household committed a crime and the others failed to report it, all of them were punished. If one reported it, they were rewarded. In a single stroke, Shang Yang turned the entire population into a network of mutual surveillance. There was nowhere to hide a crime, because your own neighbors were now your jailers, watching out of pure self-preservation. Heavy punishments were applied even to small offenses, on the theory that if minor crimes are crushed hard enough, serious crimes never get the chance to begin. He attacked the family next. Large extended households, where several adult sons lived under one roof, were taxed punishingly, which forced families to split into small separate units. More households meant more taxpayers, more conscripts, and more men working their own plots of land. Everything pointed toward two activities the state actually valued: farming and fighting. Shang Yang's worldview reduced all useful human life to those two functions. Grow the grain that feeds the armies, or be the soldier who wins the wars. Merchants, scholars, wandering talkers, and anyone who lived by their wits rather than by the plow or the sword were treated as parasites, taxed, restricted, and despised. To make all of this real, the law had to be believed. There is a famous story about how Shang Yang established that belief. He had a tall wooden pole set up at the south gate of the market and announced that anyone who carried it to the north gate would be paid a large reward. The amount was so high for so trivial a task that people assumed it was a trick and refused to touch it, so he raised the reward even higher. Finally, one man, half as a joke, picked up the pole and carried it across, and Shang Yang paid him immediately, in full, in public. The point was not the pole, the point was the message. The state means exactly what it says. Rewards are real, and if rewards are real, then so are the punishments. From that day, when Qin's government issued an order, people obeyed because they had learned that this government did not bluff. The reforms went deeper still. He standardized weights and measures across the state, so that taxes and rations and trade were uniform everywhere. He reorganized the countryside into administrative districts run by appointed officials who answered directly to the central government rather than by hereditary local lords. He encouraged settlers to come to Qin from other states by offering them land and exemption from military service, importing farmers to grow the food while native Qin men did the fighting. And he moved the capital to a new central site called Xianyang, building it from scratch as the headquarters of his new order. The results were staggering. Within a generation, Qin transformed from a struggling frontier state into the most efficient and disciplined power in China. Its armies were motivated as no others were, because every common soldier knew that enemy heads were the currency of personal advancement. Its agriculture boomed. Its administration was clean and centralized. Its people were, frankly, terrified of their own government, and that fear translated into obedience and productivity. Qin recovered the lost Hexi region from Wei and began to push its borders outward again. The contempt of the eastern states started to curdle into fear. But there was a price, and Shang Yang paid it personally. The reforms had made him the most hated man among the old Qin aristocracy, the very people whose privileges he had destroyed. He had also, at one point, brutally punished the tutors of the crown prince when the young prince broke a new law, because the law had to apply to everyone and the prince himself could not be touched. He humiliated powerful men, and powerful men have long memories. As long as Duke Xiao lived, Shang Yang was protected, but Duke Xiao died, and the crown prince he had once humiliated became the new ruler. The knives came out instantly. Shang Yang was accused of plotting rebellion. He tried to flee, and here the story turns darkly perfect. As he ran, he tried to stay overnight at an inn, and the innkeeper refused to take him, because the law required guests to be registered, and an unregistered guest would bring punishment down on the whole household. The law Shang Yang himself had written now trapped its own author with nowhere to sleep. He was caught, and he was executed in one of the most gruesome ways the Qin had, torn apart by chariots pulling in different directions. His whole family was wiped out. But here is the crucial thing. They killed the man and kept the machine. The Qin rulers who came after had no intention of undoing reforms that had made them powerful. Shang Yang, the person, was destroyed. Shang Yang, the system, became the permanent operating code of the Qin state. For the next century, no matter who sat on the throne, Qin ran on the cold, efficient, merciless logic he had installed. And that logic was now pointed east. Kings, diplomats, and the first conquests. With the machine running, the next several rulers of Qin set about using it. The first of them was Duke Xiao's son, who took a step that announced Qin's new confidence to the entire world. He stopped calling himself a duke. He called himself a king. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. In theory, there was only one king in the Chinese world, the Zhou king, the sacred figure at the top of the old order. For a regional lord to claim the royal title was to declare openly that the old hierarchy was dead and that he answered to no one above him. By the late 4th century BC, several of the great states had begun doing exactly this, throwing off the last shreds of deference to the Zhou. When the ruler of Qin took the title of king, around the year 325 BC, he was saying plainly that Qin now stood among the very greatest powers, equal to any and subordinate to none. This king, known as Hui Wen, did two things that mattered enormously. First, he expanded the state's resources by a huge margin. To the southwest of Qin lay two rich, fertile regions, the kingdoms of Shu and Ba, in the area of modern Sichuan. They were separated from the central plains by mountains, somewhat isolated, and immensely productive farmland. When a war broke out between Shu and Ba, Qin faced a choice: strike south into these fertile basins, or push east against the other warring states. There was a sharp debate at court. One faction argued that grabbing the eastern heartland was the path to glory. A general named Sima Kuo argued the opposite. "Take the south first," he said. "It is rich, it is defensible, it will feed your armies and fund your wars, and the eastern states are too strong and too watchful to be taken cheaply right now." The king listened to the patient argument. Qin marched south, conquered both Shu and Ba, and absorbed one of the great rice baskets of the ancient world. From that point on, Qin had something none of its rivals could match: a secure, fertile rear base in the southwest, protected by mountains, pouring out grain and manpower year after year. The second thing King Hui Wen did was master diplomacy as a weapon. The era produced a whole class of brilliant traveling persuaders, men who went from court to court, selling strategies, alliances, and betrayals. Two grand approaches dominated the age. One was the vertical alliance, the idea that the 6 eastern states should band together in a north-to-south coalition to contain the growing monster in the west. The other was the horizontal alliance, the idea that Qin should reach out east and west to pick off an ally with individual states, breaking up any coalition before it could form. The vertical strategy, if it ever truly held together, could have stopped Qin cold, because the combined strength of 6 states was far greater than Qin alone. The horizontal strategy was Qin's answer, and Qin played it masterfully. The great master of the horizontal approach in Qin's service was a persuader named Zhang Yi. His method was to travel among the eastern states and use a poisonous mix of bribes, threats, false promises, and exploitation of their mutual jealousies to keep them divided. He would promise one state land if it would only abandon the coalition, then fail to deliver once the coalition had broken. He would frighten another state into a separate peace by painting its neighbors as the real threat. Again and again, the eastern states proved unable to trust one another long enough to present a united front. Each one calculated its own short-term advantage, and Qin grew fat on their division. This is one of the great lessons of the whole period. Qin's enemies, taken together, were stronger than Qin, but they were never together for long, and Qin made sure of it. There was a brief, almost comic interruption to all this seriousness. King Huiwen's successor, a young and physically powerful king, was apparently obsessed with feats of strength. During a visit to the old Zhou capital, he insisted on trying to lift one of the great ceremonial bronze cauldrons, the massive ritual vessels that symbolize sovereignty itself. He got it off the ground, and then it crushed him. He died of his injuries shortly after, young and without a clear heir of his own body, which threw the succession briefly into question. It is a strange footnote. A king of the rising superpower killed by his own vanity and a heavy pot. But the machine absorbed even this. The succession was sorted out, a new king took the throne, and Qin's relentless advance continued, without missing more than a step. That new king would reign for more than half a century, and under him, Qin would stop merely growing and start, slowly and methodically, to destroy. The long reign and the butcher of Changping. The king who came to the throne now is usually called King Zhaoxiang, and his reign was one of the longest and most consequential in the entire period, stretching across more than 50 years in the 3rd century BC. He was patient, calculating, and utterly committed to the grinding expansion of Qin power. He did not need to be a military genius himself, because he had the institutions to find genius for him, and the genius he found was a general named Bai Qi. Bai Qi is one of the most formidable and frightening commanders in Chinese history. He rose through Qin's merit-based ranks on the strength of pure battlefield results, and over a long career, he never seems to have lost a major campaign. His specialty was not just defeating enemy armies, but destroying them, killing so many enemy soldiers that the opposing state could not replace them for a generation. Remember the logic Shang Yang had installed. Enemy dead were the measure of success, the currency of promotion. Bai Qi took that logic to its absolute extreme. Battle after battle, the traditional accounts record enormous Qin victories, with staggering casualty figures inflicted on the other side. He was systematically bleeding the eastern states of their fighting men. The campaign that defines his career, and that horrified all of China, was the Battle of Changping, fought against the northern state of Zhao, around 260 BC. Zhao was, at this point, probably the only state with an army capable of standing up to Qin in a straight fight. Its soldiers were tough, its cavalry was excellent, and it had reformed its own military seriously. If any single state could stop Qin's advance, it was Zhao, so the showdown between them was, in a real sense, the decisive battle for the future of China. The two armies faced each other across a fortified front for a long time, neither able to break the other. The experienced Zhao commander understood the situation perfectly. Qin was fighting far from home, its supply lines were long, and time was on Zhao's side, so he refused to give battle. He dug in, held his fortifications, and waited, betting that the Qin army would exhaust itself and have to withdraw. It was the correct strategy, and it was working. So, Qin did what Qin always did. If you cannot beat the enemy on the field, divide and deceive him off it. Qin agents spread rumors and bribes inside Zhao, suggesting that the cautious commander was secretly a coward, or worse, in league with the enemy, and that the only general Qin truly feared was a different, younger, more aggressive officer. The Zhao king, impatient with the long stalemate and hungry for a decisive victory, fell for it completely. He removed his steady, defensive commander and replaced him with the aggressive young one, who promptly did exactly what Qin wanted. He came out from behind the fortifications and attacked. The moment he did, Qin sprang the trap, and they had quietly replaced their own commander too, putting the dreaded Bai Qi in charge without announcing it. Bai Qi let the Zhao army advance, then cut it off from its base with a flanking force and surrounded it completely. The encircled Zhao army was trapped without supplies. For more than a month, they were besieged in the open, slowly starving, until they were so desperate that, according to the accounts, they were reduced to cannibalism. Finally, they surrendered. Hundreds of thousands of Zhao soldiers laid down their arms. What happened next is the act that made Bai Qi's name a byword for terror. Faced with this enormous mass of prisoners, far too many to absorb or to safely release back to fight another day, he had almost all of them killed. The traditional figure, which may be exaggerated but conveys the scale of the catastrophe, is around 400,000 men. Only a few hundred of the youngest were spared and sent home to spread the horror of what had happened. It was the bloodiest single event of the entire Warring States period, and it broke Zhao as a great power. After Changping, no single state had the military strength to stop Qin in open battle. The road to total conquest now lay open, even if it would take another generation to walk it. I want to note one detail that makes Qin's military edge concrete, because it is genuinely remarkable. Qin armies were equipped with crossbows, and the bronze trigger mechanisms for those crossbows were manufactured to such precise, standardized specifications across different state workshops that the parts were effectively interchangeable. A trigger made in one arsenal could be fitted into a crossbow from another. This is mass production with interchangeable parts, an idea the West would not seriously develop until the era of muskets, more than 2,000 years later. The Qin war machine was not just brutal. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, an industrial operation. King Zhaosheng did not stop with crushing Zhao. In the year 256 BC, he did something of immense symbolic weight. He extinguished the Zhou royal house itself. The last shadow king of the Zhou, the sacred figure who had reigned in name for centuries while the real power passed elsewhere, was deposed, and the ancient ritual cauldrons that symbolized the right to rule all under heaven were carried off to Qin. The dynasty that had founded the entire Chinese political order was simply gone, snuffed out by the Western state it had once treated as a frontier servant. There was no longer even a symbolic authority above the warring kings. The center of the old world was empty, and Qin meant to fill it. As for Bai Qi, the unstoppable general met an end that fits the pattern we have already seen with Xiangyang. After a disagreement with the king and the chief minister over strategy, he fell out of favor, was stripped of his rank, and was eventually ordered to take his own life. The greatest weapon of the Qin state was discarded by the state the moment he became inconvenient. The machine did not love its servants. It used them, and when they ceased to be useful, it destroyed them. Everyone who served Qin learned to live with that knowledge, or died learning it. The merchant, the hostage, and the boy king. The final act of Qin's rise turns on one of the strangest characters in the whole story. A man who was not a soldier, not an aristocrat, and not even originally a politician. He was a merchant. His name was Lu Buwei, and he made the most profitable investment in the history of the ancient world, gambling not on goods, but on a person. To understand his scheme, you need to know about a Qin prince named Zichu. He was a grandson of King Zhaosheng, but a minor one, low in the order of succession, and not especially valued. As was common in that age, he had been sent to live in the rival state of Zhao as a hostage, a human guarantee of good behavior between the two states. It was not a comfortable posting. Relations between Qin and Zhao were terrible, especially after the slaughter at Changping, and a Qin hostage in the Zhao capital was a lonely, vulnerable, half-forgotten man with no money and no prospects. Lu Buwei, a wealthy traveling merchant, met this neglected prince and saw something nobody else did. He saw an opportunity. He reportedly went home and asked his father what kind of return you could expect from farming or from trading in jewels. The returns, his father said, were good, but limited. And what, Lu Buwei asked, about helping to establish a king? The return on that, his father admitted, was beyond calculation. So Lu Buwei decided to invest his entire fortune in turning this obscure, stranded hostage into the future ruler of the most powerful state on earth. His plan was intricate. The current crown prince of Qin had a favored wife who, crucially, had no son of her own. Whoever she adopted as her heir would inherit everything. Lu Buwei poured money into gifts and bribes, working through intermediaries to win the favor of this childless royal wife and to promote Zichu in her eyes as the perfect adopted son, devoted and loyal. He spent lavishly on Zichu himself, transforming the shabby hostage into an impressive figure who could play the part of a prince. And step by step, the plan worked. The childless royal wife adopted Zichu. His position in the succession climbed. Here the story takes its most famous and most disputed turn. Lu Buwei had a beautiful consort of his own, and at some point, this woman became the partner of the prince Zichu and bore a son. That son was named Zheng. There is an ancient and persistent rumor, recorded in the histories, that the woman was already pregnant by Lu Buwei when she went to the prince, which would make the merchant the boy's true biological father. Historians have argued about this for 2,000 years, and the truth cannot be recovered. But the rumor itself tells you how strange and tangled the origins of the coming emperor were, and how much his legitimacy would later be questioned. Then fortune accelerated everything. The old king Zhaoshang finally died after his enormous reign. His successor reigned for only a matter of days before dying himself. And so, far faster than anyone could have predicted, the Prince Lu Buwei had bet everything on. Zichu became the king of Qin. The merchant's impossible gamble had paid off beyond his father's wildest estimate. Lu Buwei was made chief minister, given a great noble title and an enormous estate, and became the most powerful man in the state. He had, quite literally, bought a kingdom. But Zichu's reign was short. Within a few years, he too was dead, and the throne passed to his son, the boy named Zheng. And here is the hinge of all of Chinese history. That boy, Zheng, was about 13 years old when he became king of Qin. He was the most powerful child on earth, sitting atop the most dangerous war machine ever built, with the merchant who had engineered his family's rise running the government in his name. The boy would grow up to be the first emperor of China. Because the new king was a child, Lu Buwei governed as regent, and for a while, he ran everything. He was, to his credit, a genuinely capable administrator and a patron of learning, even sponsoring the creation of a great encyclopedic text meant to gather all knowledge worth knowing. But his position depended on the king staying a child forever, and children grow up. As the young king Zheng moved toward adulthood, a collision became inevitable. The crisis, when it came, was a sordid scandal. Lu Buwei had long been close to the king's mother, the former merchant's consort, now the queen dowager. To distance himself from a relationship that was becoming dangerous, Lu Buwei reportedly introduced into the palace a man named Lao Ai to take his place in the queen dowager's affections. This Lao Ai gained enormous influence through the queen dowager, accumulated wealth and followers, and grew so bold that he eventually attempted an armed rebellion to seize power. possibly to install his own children by the Queen Dowager on the throne. The young king crushed the revolt with total ruthlessness. Lao Ai was executed in the most brutal fashion, torn apart by chariots, his whole faction wiped out, his children by the Queen Dowager killed, and the Queen Dowager herself placed under confinement. And Liu Buwei, tainted by his connection to the man he had introduced, was stripped of his office and his power. Sometime later, fearing worse to come and receiving a cold, threatening letter from the king, the merchant who had made an emperor took poison and died. So by his early 20s, King Zheng had cleared away every figure who had stood over him. The regent was gone. The scandal was crushed. He held absolute personal power over the strongest state in the world. And he was, by every account, brilliant, tireless, suspicious, and consumed by a single ambition that no Qin ruler before him had quite dared to make explicit, not merely to expand Qin, not merely to dominate the others, to conquer them all, every one, and to rule the entire world under heaven as one man, the spy, the canal, and the order to expel the guests. Before the great conquest could begin, there was a strange episode that revealed both how frightened Qin's neighbors had become and how skilled Qin was at turning even an attack into an advantage. The small state of Han sat directly in Qin's path, weak and terrified, and its rulers understood that they would likely be the first to be devoured. Unable to defeat Qin by force, they tried something far more cunning. They sent Qin a gift, in the form of a brilliant water engineer named Zheng Guo. On the surface, Zheng Guo came to help. He proposed to the Qin court an enormous irrigation canal, a vast public works project that would draw water across a wide stretch of dry land north of the capital. But the real purpose, the purpose Han secretly intended, was sabotage by generosity. The idea was that such a colossal project would swallow Qin's labor, money, and attention for years, exhausting the state and keeping its armies at home, digging ditches instead of marching east. It was a plan to defeat Qin by making it tired. Qin accepted the proposal and began the immense work. And then, partway through, the plot was uncovered. Zheng Guo was exposed as a Han agent, sent to drain Qin's strength. The Qin court was furious, but the anger quickly found a different target. For generations, much of Qin's greatness had been built by talented men from other states, foreigners who came west to serve a government that rewarded ability over birth. The native Qin aristocracy had long resented these outsiders, who took the highest offices and the king's favor. Now, with a foreign spy caught red-handed, the native nobles seized their moment. They argued that all these foreigners were potential traitors, and they pressed the king to expel every official who had come from another state. The king, alarmed by the Zheng Guo affair, agreed, and issued an order to drive out all the guest officials. One of the men on that expulsion list was Li Si, who had come to Qin from the southern state of Chu and was rising fast in the king's service. Facing the ruin of his career, Li Si wrote the king a letter that became one of the most famous pieces of political argument in Chinese history, usually called the Memorial Against Expelling the Guests. His case was devastatingly simple. He reminded the king that the very foundation of Qin's power had been laid by foreigners. The advisor, Bai Shi, who served Duke Mu, had not been a Qin man. Shang Yang, who built the whole legal machine, had come from Wei. Zhang Yi, who shattered Qin's enemies with diplomacy, had come from elsewhere too. Every great leap forward in Qin's rise had been driven by talent imported from outside. Li Si pointed out that the king happily filled his court with foreign treasures, fine jade, beautiful objects, and music from every state, prizing the best regardless of where it came from. Why then would he do the opposite with men, rejecting the most able simply because they were born elsewhere? To expel foreign talent, Li Si argued, was to hand it to Qin's rivals, arming the very enemies Qin meant to conquer. It would be like lending weapons to bandits and giving food to thieves. The argument worked. The king recognized that the expulsion order was a mistake, rescinded it, restored the foreign officials, and kept Li Si, whose influence now climbed higher than ever. It was a decision of enormous consequence, because Li Si would become the chief architect of the unified empire. And the canal? When the spy Zheng Guo was confronted, he made a remarkably honest defense. Yes, he admitted, the project had begun as a scheme to weaken Qin, but the finished canal, he argued, would benefit Qin for generations, turning vast tracts of poor land into rich, watered farmland. The plot might cost Han a few years of delay in being conquered, but it would make Qin permanently stronger. The king, persuaded by the logic, let him complete the work. When it was done, the canal transformed an enormous area of dry country into some of the most productive farmland in the entire state, pouring out grain year after year. The plan meant to exhaust Qin instead fed the armies that would soon destroy Han first of all. It is one of the great ironies of the age. Han's clever sabotage handed Qin the breadbasket that powered its conquest, and the spy's name was attached forever to a canal that strengthened the very state he had been sent to ruin. The battle of ideas. To understand the empire that was about to be born, and the terrible things its first emperor would do to thought itself, we have to step back from war and politics and look at ideas, because the Warring States was not only the bloodiest age in early Chinese history, it was also the most brilliant. While the armies marched, the mind of China caught fire. This is the period of what later writers called the 100 schools of thought, when rival teachers wandered from court to court, offering competing answers to the deepest question of the age. How should human beings live? And how should a state be governed? The most influential of these traditions descended from the teacher Confucius, who had lived in the earlier spring and autumn period, and whose followers carried his ideas forward for centuries. The Confucians taught that good order came from moral character, not from force. A ruler should govern by virtue and by proper ritual, cultivating benevolence in himself and respect for the bonds between ruler and subject, parent and child, elder and younger. A truly good king, they believed, would draw the loyalty of the people the way a magnet draws iron, without needing to terrorize them. The most famous Confucian of the Warring States, the teacher Mencius, pushed this further, arguing that human nature was fundamentally good and that a ruler who oppressed his people forfeited the right to rule at all. Against the Confucians stood other schools. The followers of the teacher Mozi preached a doctrine of universal love and strict frugality, condemning lavish ritual and aggressive warfare as wasteful cruelties, and arguing that officials should be chosen purely on merit. The Taoists, drawing on the mysterious sayings attributed to the sage Laozi and the playful, profound writings of Zhuangzi, went in the opposite direction from all this striving. They taught that the more a government interfered, the worse things became, and that the wise course was to act in harmony with the natural way of things, to govern lightly, and to distrust ambition, rules, and cleverness altogether. And then there were the legalists, the school that Qin had embraced and lived by for over a century. The legalists looked at all the talk of virtue and universal love and natural harmony and dismissed it as dangerous fantasy. People, they insisted, are driven by self-interest and restrained only by fear. A state cannot be run on the hope that rulers will be good and subjects will be kind. It must be run on three things: clear, published law that applies to everyone without exception, the administrative techniques by which a ruler controls his officials, keeping them uncertain, watched, and dependent, and the raw positional power of the throne itself, which commands obedience not because the ruler is wise, but because he holds the authority to reward and to kill. The man who gathered all of this into its most complete and brilliant form was a prince of the doomed state of Han, named Han Fei. He was, by tradition, a poor speaker who stammered badly, but on the page he was unmatched, the finest writer the legalist tradition ever produced. He took the scattered ideas of earlier legalist thinkers and welded them into a single ruthless system, a complete theory of how one man could control a vast state through law, technique, and power, trusting no one, relying on institutions rather than on the doubtful goodness of human hearts. Here is a striking fact about where these ideas came from. Han Fei, and Li Si as well, had both studied under the same master, a great Confucian thinker named Zunzi. Unlike Mencius, Zunzi taught that human nature was bad, and that people had to be reshaped into goodness by education, ritual, and law. His two most famous students took that bleak view of human nature, dropped his faith in ritual and moral reform, and followed the logic straight into cold legalism. The two architects of the harshest regime in early China came out of a Confucian classroom. King Zheng read Han Fei's writings and was overwhelmed by them. According to the famous account, he declared that if only he could meet the man who wrote these words, he would be content to die. He did not even realize, at first, that the author was a living man in the neighboring state of Han. When Qin's military pressure forced Han to send envoys, Han Fei himself was dispatched to the Qin court, and the king was delighted to finally meet the thinker he so admired. But here, the same pattern that runs through this entire history repeated itself. Li Si, who had studied beside Han Fei and knew perfectly well that his old schoolmate was the greater mind, feared being overshadowed. He went to the king and quietly poisoned his judgment, arguing that Han Fei, as a prince of Han, could never truly serve Qin and would always put his own state first, and that it would be dangerous to employ him and dangerous to send him home armed with knowledge of Qin. Han Fei was thrown into prison, and before the king, who soon had second thoughts, could pardon him, Li Si arranged for poison to be delivered to his cell. The greatest theorist of the legalist state died in a Qin prison, destroyed by the jealousy of the man who would help build the empire on his ideas. There is a dark symmetry in this that is hard to miss. The philosophy Han Fei perfected taught that a ruler should trust no one and should keep even his closest servants in a state of fear and suspicion. That philosophy became the operating code of the empire, and it consumed its own author. The victory of legalism over all the other schools was now complete in practice, even as Han Fei lay dead, and that victory had a terrible logical endpoint waiting at the end of the road. A state that regards competing ideas not as a resource to be debated, but as a threat to be eliminated, will, sooner or later, come for the books and for the men who write them. When the first emperor later ordered the burning of the books and the destruction of the scholars, he was not betraying the philosophy of his state. He was carrying it to its conclusion, the Great Conquest. Now we come to the climax of 7 centuries of patient growth. Between roughly 230 and 221 BC, in just about a decade, the king of Qin conquered all 6 of the rival great states and ended the warring states period forever. It was the most consequential decade in ancient Chinese history. The king did not do this alone, and he did not do it by improvising. He had a clear strategy, shaped by his advisors, the most important of whom was a cold and brilliant minister named Li Si, a man steeped in the same legalist thinking that had built the Qin state. The strategy was the one Qin had refined for generations, applied now with total commitment. Befriend the distant states and attack the near ones. Bribe and divide the enemy so they could never unite. And take them one at a time, in an order that prevented any of them from coming to the other's aid. Qin agents flooded the eastern courts with gold, buying corrupt ministers, sowing distrust, and arranging for capable enemy officials to be slandered and removed. The conquest was fought as much with silver as with steel. The first to fall was Han, the smallest and weakest of the 7, wedged right against Qin's eastern border. It was overrun quickly, around 230 BC, and absorbed into the Qin administrative system. The first of the 6 was gone. Next came Zhao, the state that had been so terribly broken at Changping a generation earlier, but had clawed its way back to some strength and still possessed capable generals. Zhao fought hard. There was a gifted Zhao commander who actually defeated Qin forces in the field more than once and proved a real obstacle, so Qin did not try to simply outfight him. They bribed corrupt officials at the Zhao court to slander this general as a traitor, and the Zhao king, foolish and suspicious, had his best commander killed. With the only man who could stop them removed by their own hand, the Zhao defenses collapsed, and around 228 BC, the Qin armies took the Zhao capital, the same trick that had won Changping, manipulating a king into destroying his own best general, won the final campaign too. It was around this time that the most famous attempt to stop the conqueror took place. The northeastern state of Yan, watching Qin devour its neighbors and knowing its own turn was coming, decided that the only hope was to kill the king of Qin himself. The crown prince of Yan recruited a brave assassin named Jing Ke and sent him to the Qin court under the cover of a diplomatic mission, carrying gifts designed to win an audience, including a map case in which a poisoned dagger was hidden. Jing Ke got his audience. He unrolled the map before the king, and as the last of it unrolled, the dagger was revealed. He lunged. What followed was a desperate, almost farcical chase around the throne hall. The king struggling to draw his own long sword, courtiers forbidden by law to carry weapons in his presence and unable to help, until finally the king got his blade free and cut the assassin down. The attempt failed completely, and it gave the king all the justification he needed to fall upon Yan with extra fury. The Yan campaign was pressed hard, and within a few years Yan too was destroyed. The state of Wei fell around 225 BC. Its great capital taken when Qin engineers diverted the waters of nearby rivers to flood the city until its walls collapsed and it surrendered. Water, like silver, was just another weapon in the Qin arsenal. The hardest fight of all was against Chu, the vast southern state, enormous in territory and population. The king of Qin first asked a confident young general how many men he would need to conquer Chu, and the young general said a couple 100,000 would do. He asked an older, more cautious veteran named Wang Jian the same question, and Wang Jian said it would take 600,000, essentially the entire military strength of Qin. The king, thinking the old man timid, gave the job to the confident young general with the smaller force, and Chu, fighting on its home ground with everything it had, defeated him badly. Chastened, the king went personally to the retired Wang Jian, apologized, and begged him to take command with the full 600,000 he had asked for. The old general agreed, but he was cautious in a deeper way too. Knowing that commanding nearly the entire army of a paranoid king was extremely dangerous, he repeatedly and loudly asked the king for grants of land and fine houses for his family, playing the part of a greedy, unambitious old man with no designs on power, precisely so the king would not fear that he might turn his enormous army against the throne. It was a brilliant act of political survival. Wang Jian led the huge army into Chu, refused to be drawn into battle prematurely, wore the Chu forces down over a long campaign, and then crushed them. Around 223 BC, mighty Chu fell. With it went the last state that had any real chance of resisting. The final state, Qi, in the Far East, had spent the entire conquest doing nothing. For decades, Qin had cultivated Qi with gifts and false friendship, encouraging it to stay neutral while its fellow states were destroyed one by one. The Qi king, short-sighted and corrupted by Qin's bribes, watched the other 5 fall and did not lift a finger to help any of them, believing his friendship with Qin would protect him. When the other 5 were gone, and Qin's armies finally marched on Qi, in the year 221 BC, the Qi king, with no allies left in the world and an army that had not fought in years, surrendered almost without a fight. The reward for his decades of cowardly neutrality was the destruction of his state anyway. And with that, it was done. In the year 221 BC, for the first time in history, the entire core of the Chinese world was united under a single ruler. The longest age of warfare anyone could remember was over. 6 royal houses had been extinguished. The boy who had become king at 13 was now the master of everything under heaven. He was about 38 years old, and he was not satisfied with being a king. A king, after all, was just what the rulers of those 6 defeated states had called themselves. He needed a title that no one had ever held, because he had done something no one had ever done: the first emperor. The new master of China summoned his ministers and told them to find him a title worthy of his achievement. The old word king was no longer enough. He had surpassed every king. His scholars searched the most ancient legends for the grandest words they could find, the titles of the mythical god kings and sage rulers of the deep past, figures so revered they were almost divine. From these ancient words they assembled a new title, and the king modified it himself into something unprecedented. He would be Huangdi, a word usually translated as emperor, combining the terms for these legendary sovereigns into a single supreme rank above all earthly kings. And he added something more. He declared that he would be known as the first emperor, Shi Huangdi. His successors would be the second emperor, the third emperor, and so on, numbered in an unbroken line that he expected to continue for 10,000 generations. This is the title history remembers him by. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. He genuinely seems to have believed he was founding not just a dynasty, but a permanent order, a single imperial system that would govern China forever under his bloodline. To set himself apart from all ordinary mortals, he reserved special words for himself alone. The personal pronoun a ruler used to refer to himself was now restricted to the emperor only. His commands were given a special name that marked them as imperial decrees. Even certain words connected to his name and person were made taboo for everyone else. He was creating not just a government but a kind of sacred distance between himself and the entire human race. He stood alone at the apex, and everyone else, from the highest minister to the lowest farmer, was simply a subject. He also embraced a theory of cosmic legitimacy that was popular among the thinkers of the age. According to this theory, history moved through a cycle of 5 elemental phases: fire, water, earth, wood, and metal, each phase succeeding and overcoming the last, and each dynasty ruling under the sign of one element. The previous Zhou order, it was held, had ruled under fire, and water overcomes fire. So the first emperor declared that Qin ruled under the power of water. This was not mere decoration. Water was associated with the color black, with the north, with the number 6, and with cold, harsh, unyielding qualities. Qualities that fit the legalist character of the state perfectly. The emperor adopted black as the imperial color. Court robes, banners, and ceremonial objects turned black. He favored the number 6 in official measures. And the cold, severe nature of water was taken as cosmic confirmation that strict law and harsh punishment were exactly how the world was meant to be governed under Qin. The universe itself, the theory said, was on the side of the new order. Here was a man who had inherited the hardest, most disciplined state in the world, sharpened it into a weapon, used it to conquer everything, and now believed that his rule was written into the very structure of the cosmos. There was in his mind no longer any limit on what he could attempt, and what he attempted next would reshape China so deeply that the shape has lasted, in some ways, right up to the present day. One writing, one law, one empire. Conquering the 6 states was, in a sense, the easy part. The harder problem was holding them, The emperor now ruled an enormous territory full of peoples who, just a few years earlier, had been citizens of separate kingdoms, with their own rulers, their own laws, their own customs, even their own ways of writing. Left alone, these regions would drift apart and rebel at the first opportunity. The first emperor and his chief minister Li Si understood this clearly, and their response was one of the most ambitious programs of standardization and centralization in human history. The first and most fundamental decision was about how to organize the land itself. Throughout the campaign, some advisors urged the emperor to follow the ancient model and parcel out the conquered territories to his sons and loyal followers as semi-independent fiefs, recreating the kind of feudal structure the Zhou had used. The emperor and Li Si rejected this completely, and for a sharp reason. They pointed out that the entire catastrophe of the warring states had grown out of exactly that kind of arrangement. The Zhou had handed out fiefs. Those fiefs had grown into independent states, and those states had spent centuries slaughtering one another. To recreate that system would be to plant the seeds of the next civil war. So instead, the empire was divided into administrative districts, commanderies, and counties, governed not by hereditary lords, but by officials appointed directly by the central government, paid by the central government, and removable by the central government. These officials had no inherited claim to their territory, and could be rotated, promoted, or dismissed at the emperor's pleasure. It was a centralized bureaucratic state, and it is, in its essentials, how China would be governed for the next 2,000 years. This single decision may be the most lasting thing the Qin ever did. To break the power of the old aristocracies for good, the emperor reportedly ordered the wealthiest and most powerful families of the conquered states, tens of thousands of households, to be uprooted from their home regions and resettled near the capital, where they could be watched and where they were cut off from their local power bases. He also ordered the weapons of the conquered states to be collected and confiscated, melted down, and according to the traditional account, cast into enormous bronze statues and bells set up in the capital. A disarmed population, with its old leaders relocated and supervised, was far less able to rebel. Then came the great work of unification through standardization. Before the conquest, the different states had used different scripts, so that the same word might be written in noticeably different forms in Qin and in Chu and in Qi. This made administration across the empire nearly impossible, so Li Si oversaw the standardization of the writing system, establishing a single official script for the whole empire and abolishing the regional variants. From this point on, an official in the far south and an official in the far north could read the same documents in the same characters. This standardized writing became one of the great unifying forces of Chinese civilization, holding the culture together across enormous distances and across spoken dialects that were mutually unintelligible. People in different regions might not be able to understand one another's speech, but they could all read the same text. That is a Qin inheritance. The standardization went further, into the smallest details of daily life. Weights and measures were unified across the empire, so that a unit of grain or a length of cloth meant the same thing everywhere, which made taxation, trade, and rationing consistent. The currency was standardized too, with the old jumble of regional coins, knife-shaped and spade-shaped and otherwise, replaced by a single official coin, round with a square hole in the center. A design so practical that it remained the basic form of Chinese coinage for more than 2,000 years. Even the axle width of carts was standardized, so that wheels would fit into the same ruts on the same roads everywhere, which on the deeply worn dirt highways of the time was a real improvement in transport. One script, one set of weights, one coin, one road gauge. The emperor was, quite literally, trying to make the whole world run on a single set of specifications, This is the natural place to step back and look at who actually lived in this new empire and how. At the very top stood the emperor and the imperial clan, set apart from all other humans by ceremony, taboo, and law, dressed in the black silk of the water power, dwelling in palaces of a scale that ordinary people could not imagine. Just below came the officials, the scholar administrators who ran the commanderies and counties, men who held no hereditary land but rose and fell on the favor of the state, dressed according to rank, paid in grain and goods, wielding enormous local power as the visible face of the emperor's will. Then came the great mass of the population, the farmers, who in the legalist scheme were the honored backbone of the state, because they produced the grain that fed the armies and paid the taxes. A farming household lived in a modest dwelling of rammed earth, ate a diet built around millet in the north and rice in the south, supplemented with vegetables, soybeans, and only rarely meat, dressed in rough hemp cloth rather than silk, and owed the state both a heavy share of its harvest and long periods of labor service and military conscription. Below the farmers in social esteem, though sometimes far above them in wealth, were the artisans who made goods and the merchants who traded them. The merchants in particular despised an official ideology as parasites who grew rich without producing food and burdened with restrictions and heavy obligations. And beneath everyone were the convicts and conscripted laborers, vast armies of them, men and women sentenced under the harsh Qin laws or simply drafted by the state, who did the backbreaking work of building the walls, roads, palaces, and tombs that the emperor demanded. Their clothing was the coarsest, their food the barest ration, their lives often short. The social customs of the age were shaped above all by legalist discipline. Families were small and registered. Neighbors watched one another. Status was bound up with rank and service to the state, and the rituals of the old aristocratic world were suppressed in favor of obedience to law. It was an orderly society, and it was a fearful one. All of this standardization and control was a genuine achievement. Within just a few years, a patchwork of war-torn kingdoms had been welded into a single administered empire with a common script, a common currency, a common system of measurement, and a single chain of command running from the emperor down to the lowest county. No one had ever done anything like it. But it had been done at enormous human cost, and it had been done fast, by force, with no time for the conquered peoples to grow loyal to the new order. Beneath the impressive surface of unity, resentment was building, and the emperor, far from easing the pressure, was about to increase it dramatically by launching a series of construction projects on a scale the world had never seen: walls, roads, and a buried world. The first emperor did not rest after the conquest. If anything, the unification only freed up the vast resources of the empire for projects that matched the scale of his ambition. And his ambitions ran in every direction at once: north against the nomads, south into the jungles, across the empire in great highways, and downward into the earth toward his own immortality. To the north lay a problem that would trouble China for the next 2,000 years. The nomadic horse peoples of the steppe, at this time a confederation known as the Xiongnu. They were mobile, fierce raiders who struck the settled farmland of the north and vanished back into the grasslands before slow infantry armies could catch them. The emperor sent one of his most trusted generals, Meng Tian, north with an enormous army to drive the Xiongnu back, which he did, pushing them out of the great bend of the Yellow River and seizing the territory there for Qin settlement. But driving the nomads back was not enough, because they could always return. So the emperor ordered the construction of a vast defensive barrier across the entire northern frontier. This is the origin of what we loosely call the Great Wall. It is important to be accurate here. The first emperor did not build the famous stone wall that tourists visit today. That grand structure was built far later, under a much later dynasty. What the Qin did was connect and extend the various walls that the individual northern states had already built during the Warring States period for their own defense, joining them into one continuous fortified line stretching across thousands of miles of frontier. The Qin Wall was mostly rammed earth, not dressed stone, but its scale was still staggering. Hundreds of thousands of conscripted laborers, soldiers, and convicts were sent north to build it, hauling earth in baskets across mountains and deserts in brutal conditions. Enormous numbers of them died in the process of exhaustion, cold, hunger, and accident, and a deep popular bitterness grew up around the wall. In later folklore, it became a symbol of the cruelty of the Qin, the place where countless ordinary people were worked to death to feed one ruler's ambition. The wall did its job militarily, providing a defensive line and a base for patrolling the frontier, but it was built on a foundation of suffering that the people did not forget. While the wall went up in the north, the emperor pushed south as well, into the humid, mountainous lands of the far south, inhabited by peoples the Qin called the Baiyue. These campaigns were difficult, fought in unfamiliar terrain against determined resistance and through disease-ridden country. To supply the southern armies, Qin engineers built a remarkable canal that linked two river systems across a watershed, allowing boats to carry grain from the north deep into the southern frontier. It was a genuine feat of hydraulic engineering, one that connected the heartland to the far south and helped extend Chinese settlement into regions that would remain part of China ever after. The conquered south was organized into new commanderies and settled with soldiers and migrants from the north. One of the officers left to govern this distant frontier was a man named Zhao Tuo, and his later career shows just how far Qin's reach had stretched. When the empire collapsed only a few years afterward, Zhao Tuo sealed off the mountain passes that led into the south, cut himself loose from the dying dynasty, and set himself up as the independent ruler of his own southern kingdom, which he governed for decades. The point is that even as the Qin dynasty died in the north, the expansion it had driven into the far south did not reverse. The reach of Chinese power into those southern lands, begun by the first emperor's armies, became permanent. Across the whole empire, the emperor ordered the construction of a network of imperial highways radiating out from the capital, broad, well-built roads that allowed the rapid movement of armies, officials, and messages. He also built special elevated roads and direct military highways through difficult terrain to speed the army to the frontiers. The empire was being physically wired together, knit by roads and canals, into a single connected body that the central government could reach and control. This too was a real achievement, and like the others, it consumed labor, materials, and lives on an immense scale. And then there were the projects built purely for the emperor himself. He began construction of a palace complex of legendary size, the Yipang Palace, intended to be the grandest royal residence ever built, though it was never finished. And, most famously of all, he poured the resources of the empire into his own tomb. The first emperor had begun building his mausoleum at the foot of a mountain near the capital, possibly from the very start of his reign, and the work expanded enormously after the conquest gave him the whole empire's labor to command. According to the ancient account, some 700,000 conscripted workers labored on the tomb complex. They dug deep into the earth and constructed beneath an artificial mountain, a vast underground palace meant to house the emperor in death exactly as he had lived in life, surrounded by treasures and by a model of his entire realm. The ancient historian who described it, writing about a century later, recorded astonishing details. The tomb chamber, he wrote, contained representations of the rivers and seas of China, rendered in flowing mercury, with the heavens depicted above and the earth below, and was protected by automatic crossbows set to fire at intruders. For a long time, parts of this account were dismissed as legend. But here is a genuinely remarkable fact from modern times. When scientists tested the soil of the great burial mound that still stands over the unexcavated tomb, they found unusually high concentrations of mercury in the earth above it, in a pattern consistent with a large quantity of mercury sealed below. The ancient claim of rivers of mercury, written down generations after the emperor's death, appears to match the physical evidence in the ground. The central tomb itself has never been opened, partly out of respect and partly because the technology to safely excavate and preserve it does not yet exist. The emperor still lies where they buried him, more than 2,000 years ago beneath his mountain. And then there is the army. In the years since the 1970s, archaeologists working near the tomb uncovered something that no ancient text had clearly prepared them for. Buried in great pits, in military formation, stood thousands upon thousands of life-size soldiers made of terracotta clay. Infantry, archers, cavalry, charioteers, officers, each figure individually detailed, with distinct faces, hairstyles, armor, and rank, arranged in battle order as if to guard the emperor for eternity. They had been painted in bright colors, now mostly faded, and equipped with real bronze weapons. The sheer scale of the Terracotta Army, the artistry of it, and the organization required to produce it, tell you everything about the Qin state at its height. Here was a society capable of mobilizing immense skilled labor toward a single overwhelming purpose, capable of standardized mass production combined with individual craftsmanship, and ruled by a man who could not imagine death without an army at his command. The clay soldiers are, in a way, the perfect portrait of the empire. Disciplined, vast, magnificent, and built for one man. All of this, the wall, the roads, the canal, the palaces, the tomb, the army of clay, was happening at the same time, drawing on the same exhausted population. Millions of laborers were conscripted. Heavy taxes were levied to pay for it all. The harsh Qin laws meant that men who failed to meet a labor deadline could face severe punishment, even death. The machine that had been so effective at conquest was now grinding its own people into the ground in the service of one man's vision. The empire was a marvel. It was also a furnace, and the fuel was its own people, the war on memory and the hunger for forever. As the emperor's power grew without limit, so did his intolerance of any voice that questioned him. And the voices that questioned him most came from the scholars, the inheritors of the older traditions of thought that had flourished in the days before unification. The conflict came to a head at a banquet at court. A scholar stood up and praised the emperor, but then suggested, in the careful language of the old learning, that the emperor would be wiser to follow the ancient models, to grant territories to his sons and rely on tradition, rather than ruling everything directly through this novel centralized system. The implication was clear. The old ways were better, and the emperor's whole new order was a mistake. The chief minister Li Si responded with a furious argument that became one of the most infamous policy proposals in history. The scholars, he said, were using their study of the past to criticize the present, holding up old precedents to undermine the emperor's new laws and confusing the common people. As long as private individuals could study and debate the ancient texts, they would always have a basis for opposing the state. The solution, Li Si argued, was to control knowledge itself. What followed is remembered as the burning of the books. The emperor ordered that the historical records of the conquered states, which celebrated their independent pasts, be destroyed. He ordered that privately held copies of the classic texts of poetry, history, and the various competing schools of philosophy be surrendered and burned. Certain practical books were spared, works on medicine, agriculture, divination, and the like, the useful knowledge the state wanted to keep. And copies of the forbidden texts were retained in the imperial archives, so the destruction was aimed at private study rather than at total annihilation. But the intent was unmistakable. The state was trying to monopolize learning, to cut the people off from the intellectual traditions that gave them any standard by which to judge their rulers, and to make the present untouchable by burning the records of the past. Anyone who dared to discuss the forbidden classics in private faced execution. It was an assault on memory itself. The following year brought an even darker episode, remembered as the burying of the scholars. The story is bound up with the emperor's growing obsession, an obsession that had come to dominate his mind in his later years. He had become desperate to avoid death. He wanted to live forever. The first emperor, having conquered the entire known world and built wonders, could not accept that he, like every other man, would simply die. So he surrounded himself with a class of men, variously called alchemists, magicians, and masters of esoteric arts, who promised that they could find or brew an elixir of immortality, a substance that would let the emperor live without end. He poured wealth into their searches. He sent expeditions to the eastern seas to find the legendary islands of the immortals, where the elixir of life was said to grow. One famous expedition, led by a man named Xu Fu, set sail with a great company of young people and craftsmen to find these islands and never returned, a voyage that later legend would connect, probably falsely, to the distant lands across the sea. The emperor consumed potions and preparations that the alchemists supplied, some of which, given the chemistry of the age, likely contained mercury and other toxic substances, meaning that his very pursuit of eternal life may have been slowly poisoning him. When some of these alchemists, knowing perfectly well that they could not actually deliver immortality and fearing the emperor's wrath when he discovered the fraud, fled and spoke ill of him behind his back, the emperor flew into a rage. He ordered an investigation into the scholars and practitioners in the capital. Under interrogation, they accused one another, and in the end, the emperor had a large number of them. The traditional figure is around 460, rounded up and executed. According to the account, by being buried in or near the capital as a terrible warning to the rest. The exact nature of who these victims were and how they died has been debated by historians, but the episode entered tradition as the burying of the scholars, and together with the burning of the books, it became the great symbol of Qin tyranny over the mind. The first emperor's own eldest son, the crown prince Fusu, reportedly objected to the harshness of these measures and urged restraint. For his trouble, his father sent him away from the capital to the northern frontier to oversee the army building the wall. That decision, banishing the moderate heir to the distant north, would have enormous consequences very soon. The emperor's fear was not entirely irrational, because there were people in the conquered lands who wanted very badly to kill him. The destruction of the 6 states had left countless aristocrats, loyalists, and grieving families nursing a desire for revenge, and more than once, that desire came close to ending his life. On one of his tours, a young nobleman of the destroyed state of Han, a man named Zhang Liang, who burned to avenge his ruined family, hired a powerful strongman to ambush the imperial procession at a place called Bolangsha. The assassin hurled an enormous iron weight at the emperor's carriage, but it struck the wrong vehicle in the convoy, and the emperor, who was known to vary which carriage he rode in precisely to foil such attempts, survived. Zhang Liang escaped the manhunt that followed and would surface again years later as one of the master strategists who helped bring down the dynasty and found the one that replaced it. Another attempt came from a blind musician named Gao Jianli, a friend of the earlier would-be assassin Jing Ke. Gao Jianli was so gifted with a stringed instrument that his playing eventually brought him into the emperor's presence to perform, despite his connection to the failed plot. He had lead poured into the body of his instrument to turn it into a heavy weapon, and during a performance, he swung it at the emperor. He missed, and he was executed. These repeated attempts deepened the emperor's secrecy to an extraordinary degree. He had covered walkways and walled roads built between his many palaces so that he could move among them unseen. And he kept his exact location a closely guarded secret, reportedly putting to death attendants who let slip where he was on a given day. He surrounded his own movements in fog, so that no enemy could ever be sure where to strike. That same obsessive secrecy about his whereabouts would, after his death, make it terribly easy for a few men to hide that he had died at all. So this is the portrait of the emperor in his final years. A man of boundless power and boundless fear, who had unified a civilization and was now burning its books, who had conquered death's old enemies on the battlefield and could not conquer death itself, who chased magic potions while crushing the scholars who refused to lie to him, and who pushed away the one heir who might have softened the regime. He kept moving, traveling on great tours of inspection across his empire, partly to assert his authority over the conquered lands, partly perhaps because a man terrified of death cannot sit still. He raised stone monuments inscribed with praise of his own achievements at sacred mountains. He searched the coasts for the islands of the immortals, and it was on one of these great tours, far from his capital, that death finally found him anyway. Death on the road and the great lie. In the year 210 BC, the first emperor set out on what would be his final tour of the empire, a long journey through the eastern and southern regions, accompanied by a small inner circle. Among them were his chief minister Li Si, a younger son named Hu Hai whom the emperor favored, and a powerful palace official named Zhao Gao, who served as a kind of chief eunuch and keeper of the imperial seals and had been a tutor to the young prince Hu Hai. These three men, and the choices they made in the days around the emperor's death, would determine the fate of the empire. Somewhere on the road, far from the capital, the emperor fell gravely ill. As death approached, he is said to have finally faced the question of succession and to have dictated a letter to his banished eldest son, the moderate crown prince Fusu, who was away in the north with the army. The letter ordered Fusu to return to the capital to arrange the funeral, which, in effect, named him as the successor. This was the natural and proper choice, the elder son, the one with administrative and military experience, the one who would likely have ruled more gently. The letter was sealed, and then, before it could be sent, the first emperor died. What happened next is one of the most consequential conspiracies in history. The emperor died far from the capital, and only a handful of people knew. The keeper of the seals, Zhao Gao, held the sealed letter that would have brought Fusu to power, and Zhao Gao did not want Fusu to rule. He feared, with good reason, that under the serious-minded elder prince, he would lose his own influence, and that Fusu favored the general Meng Tian, who was Zhao Gao's enemy. So Zhao Gao made a decision of stunning audacity. He decided to suppress the true letter and forge a different succession. He went first to the young prince Hu Hai, the emperor's favorite younger son who was there on the tour, and persuaded him, against his initial reluctance, to seize the throne for himself in defiance of his dead father's wishes. Then, Zhao Gao turned to the chief minister Li Si, the most powerful official in the empire, and this was the harder task, because Li Si was the architect of the whole Qin system and had every reason to want a lawful succession. Zhao Gao worked on him with a cold and brilliant argument. He pointed out that the elder prince Fusu trusted and favored the general Meng Tian, and that if Fusu came to power, he would surely make Meng Tian his chief minister, and Li Si would be cast aside, stripped of everything, perhaps killed. Li Si, faced with the loss of all he had built and feared, finally and shamefully agreed to join the conspiracy. The architect of the Qin legal order chose to betray the law to save himself. The three conspirators kept the emperor's death a secret. To hide the smell of the decomposing body during the long journey back to the capital in the summer heat, they reportedly loaded a cart with salted fish to mask the odor, and they continued to bring meals to the imperial carriage and to relay forged orders as if the emperor were still alive inside. It is a grotesque image. The corpse of the man who conquered the world being trundled across the empire in secret, surrounded by rotting fish, while his servants pretended he still lived and quietly stole the future of his dynasty. When everything was arranged, they sent out a forged edict, sealed with the imperial seal that Zhao Gao controlled. The forged document did two things. It named the young prince Hu Hai as the new emperor, and it ordered the elder son Fu Su and the general Meng Tian to commit suicide, falsely accusing them of disloyalty. The order reached Fu Su in the north. The general Meng Tian was suspicious and urged the prince to verify the command before obeying, since such a grave order ought to be confirmed. But Fu Su, a dutiful son to the end, believed the forged words came from his father and could not bring himself to question or resist them. He took his own life. The general Meng Tian, refusing at first, was imprisoned and later forced to die as well. With the rightful heir dead by his own hand and the most powerful general removed, the conspiracy was complete. The party returned to the capital. The emperor's death was finally announced, and the young Hu Hai was installed as the second emperor. So the most powerful empire ever built passed, through a forged letter and a cart of fish, from a brilliant and terrifying founder to a weak and pliable young man, controlled by the schemer who had put him on the throne. The first emperor had dreamed of 10,000 generations. His line would not survive the second emperor, and the deer. The young man now installed as the second emperor was, by every account, completely unfit to rule. He had not earned the throne, did not understand the workings of the vast machine he had inherited, and was entirely under the influence of Zhao Gao, the man who had engineered his rise. The story of the second emperor's reign is really the story of Zhao Gao consolidating power while the empire fell apart around them both. Zhao Gao's first concern was security. The second emperor had brothers and sisters, other children of the first emperor, who had a better claim to the throne than he did, and who knew, or might guess, the truth about how he had seized it. So Zhao Gao encouraged the new emperor to eliminate the threat at its root. In a series of purges, the second emperor had many of his own brothers and sisters put to death, along with officials and ministers thought to be unreliable. The court was bathed in the blood of the imperial family and the old administration. Anyone who might oppose Zhao Gao, or who simply knew too much, was swept away. Terror, which had always been a tool of the Qin state, now turned inward and began devouring the rulers themselves. With the imperial family slaughtered and the loyal officials purged, Zhao Gao became the true master of the empire, ruling through the puppet emperor he controlled. And the famous story that captures his total domination of the court is one of the most chilling political anecdotes ever recorded. To test exactly how completely he controlled the officials, and to identify anyone who still dared to think independently, Zhao Gao presented a deer to the second emperor and the assembled court and called it a horse. The emperor laughed and said it was obviously a deer, and asked the ministers present. Some, frightened, stayed silent. Some, hoping to please Zhao Gao, agreed that yes, it was a horse. And a few honest ones said plainly that it was a deer. Zhao Gao quietly noted exactly who had dared to call the deer a deer, and afterward had those honest men destroyed. From that point on, no one at court would contradict him about anything, no matter how absurd, because to insist on the obvious truth was now a fatal act. To this day, the phrase pointing at a deer and calling it a horse survives in Chinese as an expression for a brazen, deliberate lie imposed by power, a lie everyone is forced to accept against the evidence of their own eyes. While the court drowned in this madness, the actual condition of the empire was collapsing. The brutal projects continued, even expanded. The harsh laws remained in force, with their cruel punishments for the smallest failures. The taxes and labor demands, already crushing under the first emperor, became unbearable under his incompetent son and the schemer behind him. The unifying genius that had at least given the first emperor's harshness some purpose and direction was gone. What remained was the cruelty without the competence. The machine still grinding but with no one at the controls who understood it, run by a man whose only real skill was court intrigue. The empire that had taken 7 centuries to build had been hollowed out from the top in a matter of months. And out in the countryside, among the millions of overtaxed, overworked, terrified ordinary people, the breaking point was about to arrive. It would come, fittingly, not from a rival king or a great general, but from a group of common conscripts caught in the rain, the peasants, and the first revolt. In the year 209 BC, a group of around 900 conscripted commoners was being marched across the empire to perform garrison duty at a distant post as the harsh labor laws required. Among them were 2 men whose names would never be forgotten, Qin Shi and Wu Guang. On the way, the group was caught by heavy rains that flooded the roads and made it impossible to reach their post on time. This was the kind of small misfortune that, under any reasonable government, would have meant nothing. Under the laws of Qin, it meant death. The Qin legal code prescribed execution for conscripts who failed to arrive at their assigned post by the appointed deadline, regardless of the reason, regardless of whether the delay was anyone's fault. The rain was no excuse. The 2 leaders, Qin Shi and Wu Guang, did the brutal arithmetic. They were going to be executed for being late, no matter what they did now. And if the penalty for being late was death, then the penalty for rebellion could be no worse. They had, in the most literal sense, nothing left to lose. So they made a choice that changed history. Qin Shi is remembered for a line that captured the mood of the moment and the age, a question that struck at the very root of the old order. He asked, in effect, whether kings and nobles and generals were truly a separate breed of men born to their high station by some special quality of blood, or whether any man might rise to greatness given the chance. It was a direct challenge to the entire idea that some people were born to rule and others born to obey. The conscripts, facing death anyway, rallied to him. They killed their officers, armed themselves with whatever they could find, sharpened stakes and farm tools, and rose in open revolt against the Qin Empire. They proclaimed their own state and their own kingship in defiance of the throne. What happened next astonished everyone. The revolt of these doomed conscripts did not fizzle out. It spread like fire across the empire. Everywhere, the resentment that had been building for years against the taxes, the labor service, the cruel laws, the endless projects, the relocation of families, the destruction of the old states came pouring out. Ordinary people joined the uprising in huge numbers. And crucially, so did the surviving aristocrats and ambitious men of the former 6 states, who saw in the chaos a chance to restore their old kingdoms and throw off Qin rule. Old royal houses were revived. Self-proclaimed kings sprang up across the territories of the conquered states. Within months, the empire that had seemed so invincible was engulfed in rebellion from every direction. The original peasant revolt of Qin Shi and Wu Guang did not last long. Both men were soon killed, Qin Shi reportedly murdered by his own charioteer as his fortunes turned, and their short-lived state collapsed. As pioneers often are, they were destroyed by the very upheaval they had unleashed, but the fire they had lit could not be put out. They had proven the unthinkable, that the Qin Empire could be defied, that ordinary men could take up arms against it and survive, even if only for a season. The spell of Qin invincibility was broken forever. And into the chaos they had opened stepped far more dangerous men, leaders with armies, ambition, and the skill to actually bring the empire down. 2 of them would come to dominate everything that followed, and their rivalry would shape the next chapter of Chinese history. One was an aristocratic warrior of terrifying strength and pride. The other was a commoner of low birth, sly and patient, who would end up founding the dynasty that replaced Qin, the warlords, and the fall of the capital. As the rebellion spread, two figures rose above all the others. The first was Xiang Yu, a towering, immensely strong warrior from a noble Chu military family, whose grandfather had been a famous Chu general killed by Qin. Xiang Yu carried a personal hatred of Qin in his blood, and on the battlefield he was very nearly unstoppable, a commander of ferocious courage and skill who won victory after victory. The second was Liu Bang, a man from the opposite end of society, born a commoner, a minor local official of humble background, easygoing, shrewd, generous with his followers, and far more politically cunning than he first appeared. These two men, the proud aristocrat and the sly commoner, became the leading rebel commanders, and for a time they fought on the same side against the common enemy. The decisive military blow against the Qin came at a great battle in the north, the Battle of Julu, around 207 BC. A large Qin army, commanded by a capable general named Zhang Han, was besieging a rebel-held city, and the various rebel forces had gathered to relieve it but were afraid to engage the formidable Qin troops. It was Xiang Yu who broke the deadlock. According to the famous account, after crossing the river to attack, he ordered his men to sink their boats, smash their cooking pots, and burn their shelters, leaving each soldier with only a few days' rations and no possibility of retreat. The message was absolute. There is no way back. Win or die. With this desperate all-or-nothing resolve, Xiang Yu's outnumbered force fell upon the Qin army and shattered it in a furious battle. The victory at Julu destroyed the main Qin field army and made Xiang Yu the most powerful and feared of all the rebel leaders. The Qin general Zhang Han, after holding out and then realizing the situation in the capital had become hopeless, eventually surrendered with his remaining troops. While Xiang Yu was smashing the main Qin army in the north, the cunning Liu Bang took a different path. He led a smaller force west, toward the Qin heartland and the capital itself, avoiding the strongest Qin defenses and exploiting the chaos, advancing through negotiation and selective force as much as through battle. He was racing to be the first to reach the capital, because it had been agreed among the rebels that whoever entered the Qin heartland first would have a strong claim to rule it. Meanwhile, inside the capital, the rot at the center had reached its conclusion. Zhao Gao, the schemer who controlled the second emperor, had continued his deadly intrigues, even as the empire burned. He had already engineered the downfall and gruesome execution of the chief minister Li Si, the last competent man at the top of the government, who was put to death in a horrific manner along with his family, the architect of the Qin system destroyed by the monster the system had allowed to flourish. Now, with rebel armies closing in and the situation beyond saving, Zhao Gao turned on the puppet he had created. He forced the second emperor to take his own life. Then he tried to install another member of the imperial family, a man named Ziying, as a lesser ruler, no longer even claiming the title of emperor, only of king of Qin, an admission that the empire over all of China was already lost. But Ziying was not the puppet Zhao Gao expected. Understanding that Zhao Gao intended to control or discard him as he had the others, and blaming him correctly for the ruin of the dynasty, Ziying struck first. He had Zhao Gao assassinated, finally ending the career of the man whose forgery and scheming had done so much to destroy the empire from within. But it was far too late. Ziying had been the ruler of a collapsing rump state for only about a month and a half when Liu Bang's army arrived at the capital. Recognizing that resistance was hopeless, Ziying surrendered. He came out to meet the conquerors in the white garments of mourning, bearing the imperial seals, and gave up the empire. Liu Bang, the shrewd commoner, accepted the surrender and, wisely, treated the city and its people with restraint. sparing them and spelling out simple, lenient laws to win their goodwill. That restraint did not last, because Liu Bang was not the strongest of the rebels. Xiang Yu was. And when the mighty Xiang Yu arrived at the capital with his far larger army, his fury and his hatred of Qin were given free rein. Zi Ying, the last ruler of the Qin, was put to death. The great palaces of the first emperor were given over to fire, and the accounts describe the burning as lasting for an extraordinary length of time, the splendor of the conquerors of the world consumed in flames. The capital was sacked. The imperial treasures were carried off or destroyed. The dynasty that the first emperor had expected to last 10,000 generations was utterly extinguished, only about 15 years after he had proclaimed his eternal empire. The Qin was gone, the ghost in the machine. The destruction of the Qin did not bring peace, it brought another war. The two great victors, the aristocratic warrior Xiang Yu and the cunning commoner Liu Bang, now turned on each other in a long and brutal struggle for control of the empire that Qin had built. That contest, which lasted several years, ended with the unlikely triumph of Liu Bang, the man of humble birth, who defeated the seemingly invincible Xiang Yu and went on to found a new dynasty, the Han, around 202 BC. And here is the great irony at the heart of this whole story. Liu Bang and the Han rulers who followed him had risen by destroying the hated Qin. They loudly condemned the Qin as a cruel, tyrannical regime that had earned its destruction, and they used that condemnation to justify their own rule. But when it came time to actually govern the vast territory they had inherited, they did not tear down the Qin system, they kept it. They kept the centralized administration of commanderies and counties run by appointed officials. They kept the standardized writing, the unified currency, the common weights and measures, the great roads, the basic legal apparatus, and the very idea of a single emperor ruling all under heaven through a professional bureaucracy. What they did was soften it, easing the harshest punishments, lightening the crushing taxes and labor service, and blending the cold legalist machinery with the gentler moral teachings of other schools of thought, so that the system became more humane and far more durable. The Han kept the body of the Qin state and gave it a different soul. This is why the Qin matters so enormously, far out of proportion to its brief life. The dynasty itself lasted barely a decade and a half as a unified empire and collapsed in spectacular ruin. By any ordinary measure, it was a catastrophic failure, a regime so harsh and so overreaching that it provoked its own people into destroying it almost as soon as it was finished. And yet the structure it created, the idea of a single, unified China governed as one centralized empire under one emperor, with one script and one administrative system, became the permanent template for Chinese civilization. Every later dynasty, for more than 2,000 years, ruled within the framework that the Qin had laid down. The first emperor failed to found an eternal dynasty, but he succeeded, beyond anything he could have imagined, in founding eternal China. The country that exists today, with its sense of itself as a single civilization that ought to be unified under one government, is in a real sense his creation. For a long time, almost everything we knew about the Qin came from the histories written under the dynasty that destroyed it, the Han, who had every reason to paint their predecessor as a monster of cruelty. But in the 1970s, archaeologists opened the tomb of a minor Qin legal official and found buried with him a remarkable cache of bamboo strips covered in writing. They turned out to contain actual Qin legal statutes, administrative regulations, and case records, the real working documents of the system, written by the people who ran it rather than by the enemies who overthrew it. What they reveal is fascinating. The Qin law was not the cartoonish bloodbath of later legend. It was something in some ways more unsettling, a vast, meticulous, intrusive bureaucracy that tried to regulate almost everything, from how grain was stored, to how officials handled a criminal investigation, to the precise responsibilities of village heads. Punishments were graded and detailed rather than uniformly savage, but the sheer reach of the state into ordinary life was staggering, a level of documentation and control that few governments anywhere would match for another 2,000 years. The discovery gives us a rare, direct look at the machine Shang Yang built, still running generations after his death, exactly as designed. There is a lesson here that Chinese thinkers drew almost immediately and have drawn ever since. The Qin showed that raw power, harsh law, and ruthless efficiency could conquer and unify, could build walls and roads and armies and tombs on a scale beyond imagining. But it also showed that power and law alone could not hold a society together for long, because a state that rules only through fear and gives its people nothing but burdens will provoke them to rise the moment that fear cracks. The Qin had no reserve of loyalty, no goodwill, nothing to fall back on when the projects became unbearable and the leadership turned rotten. It was all hardness and no warmth, and hardness shatters. The dynasties that lasted learned to combine the Qin's machinery of control with something the Qin lacked entirely, a claim to rule for the benefit of the people and the moral language to back it up. The Qin built the engine. Others learned to add the brakes and a reason for the passengers to stay aboard. And the first emperor himself remains one of the most argued over figures in all of history. To some, he is the great unifier, the founder of China, the visionary who ended centuries of slaughter and forged a single civilization out of warring fragments. To others, he is the archetypal tyrant, the book burner, the worker of millions to death, the paranoid would-be immortal, poisoning himself with mercury while burying scholars alive. He is, most likely, all of these at once, which is what makes him endure. He lies still beneath his mountain near the old capital, his tomb unopened, his rivers of mercury detected but undisturbed, guarded by his silent clay army. More than 2,200 years after he conquered the world and failed to conquer death, the empire he built to last 10,000 generations is gone. The China he accidentally invented is still here. If you have made it this deep into the story of the Qin, you clearly love this kind of history as much as I do. And the best thing you can do to help this channel keep making these long, detailed deep dives is to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you do not miss the next one. If you made it all the way here, you now understand the rise and fall of the Qin better than almost anyone you will ever meet. There is another full history waiting on screen right now. That one is next. If 3 hours of ancient China was worth your time, a quick subscribe tells me to keep building these. Thanks for watching.